Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Tim Wendel, and he's here today to share with us his new book, Cancer Crossings, a brother, his doctor, and the quest for a cure to childhood leukemia. Now, Tim Wendel is the author of 13 books, including Summer of '68, Castro's Curveball, and High Heat, which was an editor's choice selection by the New York Times Book Review. His writings have appeared in Esquire, GQ, Gargoyle, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Geographic. And he's a writer-in-residence at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches nonfiction and fiction. So let's welcome to the show, Tim.
Great to be with you, Marianne. How are you doing today?
Oh, I am fabulous, and I'm so excited that we're spending this time together, especially to talk about your book, Cancer Crossings.
Me too. This will be fun.
Well, and so for a lot of people that listen to the show, I get emails all the time, and one of the things that they love to learn is what inspires somebody to follow the path that they follow, and we'd love to hear about your journey.
Sure. The Cancer Crossings is my 13th book. If somebody had told me back in junior high that I'd even write a book, I would have told them they were crazy because I was a terrible speller and terrible at grammar and all this stuff. Most of my books in the past have been somewhat sports-driven. They've done some fiction, often a couple novels based in Cuba, etc. This Cancer Crossings had a very different type of genesis. My daughter, Sarah, who is now emergency room doctor doing her residency, she was in her first year of medical school at Georgetown, and she came home one night, and they must have been studying leukemia. That's about the only thing I can figure out. And at that point, they study about every disease known to man. And she said, "Dad, you had a brother die of leukemia?" And she knew part of this. I said, yeah, you don't remember. I told you a little bit about that. But then she really started hitting me with a lot of questions about medical procedures, where was the hospital, the doctors involved, etc. And frankly, Marianne, I was embarrassed. I couldn't really answer any of her, say, medical questions. And I remember she left at night, and I was like, whoa, what was that about? And I went online, got into Google Scholar, and started looking around at some things. And the first thing that jumped out at me was that back when my brother was diagnosed in 1966, leukemia, childhood leukemia, had a 10% survival rate. In other words, it was pretty much close to a death sentence. In fact, if you even looked up leukemia in the handbook for pediatrics, it was one page. And it pretty much said make the patient as comfortable as possible because he or she is soon going to leave us, unfortunately. But today, and this was kind of my daughter's viewpoint, childhood leukemia has a 90% survival rate. And I'm not a big numbers guy. I didn't do very well in algebra and geometry and all that in high school. But 10% to 90%, that got my attention. That's a pretty interesting arc, and I think you need any type of arc or major change if you're looking to do a book or a longer project. And so that got my attention, and now I'm starting to research some more, and I'm pulling up some clinical trials. Still the same night. I stayed up till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I started pulling up clinical trials about the subject back from this time period, roughly mid-60s into the mid-70s. I started seeing the same names, James Holland, Donald Kinkle, Lucius Sinks, and it suddenly occurred to me, I went, whoa, these are the guys and the nurses that did this. These are the ones that took it from a 10% to a 90% survival rate. And the next morning, I literally started, seeing if I could find them. I knew they had to be at least in their mid-80s. In fact, one was just about ready to turn 90. And so in a sense, the race was already kind of on. Could I get to these guys? Could I find these 5 or 6 doctors that were called, in a sense, within the medical community, the cancer cowboys? Could I find them in time to talk with them and, hear their story? and away we went. And that was, I've never quite had a book, start that way, with the urgency and going into a area I wasn't that well versed in, but it took off from there.
Well, with having such a personal story that comes, that has to do with leukemia and what your family went through, to discovering these doctors that, most people, unless you are dealing directly in the leukemia, having to deal with that personally or know somebody that's going through that, you may not ever hear these doctors.
Yeah, very much. I think I view them, Marianne, as a medical success story that's been overlooked in many ways. You hear today, we need a cancer moonshot. Former Vice President Joe Biden said that a couple of years ago. In a lot of ways, we had one. And it happened in the mid-'60s into the mid-'70s, and with this particular form of leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, that's what my brother suffered from and a lot of kids suffered from. They cured it. They did it. And I think in some ways the lessons of what happened there are still pretty applicable today. As I proceeded into writing and doing the research, I kind of soon hit two obstacles. One was I had to get up to speed, at least from a layperson standpoint, on the different procedures. I at least had to be able to talk coherently with these doctors. They weren't quite sure what to make of me at first. Okay, here's this guy who's done a lot of sports writing and done some novels, and now he's looking to write this, but he seems out of his element. The other thing that was somewhat problematic, but I knew it would come if I gave it enough time, is I'm starting with the doctors, but as you pointed out, a major thread or even backbone of Cancer Crossing is my family story. And I'd kind of forgotten a lot of that. Maybe I'd put it way back in the back of my mind. And so I was also trying to tease that out. What was the timeline for that? What was the timeline, say, when my brother became sick, and then what we were doing as a family, and then seeing if I could find those moments, and I eventually did find them, where in a sense the doctor's story, the stories of the cancer cowboys, intersected with the story of my family. And my hope is that people will see it as a tale of resiliency on a couple fronts, a tale of determination on several fronts. One, obviously, is the doctors, how resilient and determined they were, but also you're getting, in a sense, a snapshot of an American family dealing with this particular disease at this particular time. And there's a lot of families, unfortunately, out there still dealing with cancer. I believe the last statistic I saw was close to 1 in 3 Americans will have to deal with cancer with somebody in their family or somebody they know. And my hope is in putting my family story out there and how we coped and what we tried to do, people can find a way to move ahead too.
I think that provides a lot of hope for people who find themselves in that situation or maybe similar situations where you're reading your book going, gosh, because when you're faced with something like that, it can seem pretty hopeless.
Yeah, and what, you think about it, any disease or anything, it isolates us. We somehow think isolates the family, it isolates the individual. Somehow we're separated out from our larger world and even larger society. This was really the case back when my brother Eric was diagnosed. Some people wouldn't even say the word cancer. It was like, the boogeyman type of thing. They called it the C word and et cetera. We've come a way since then, but still, if you know of anybody who's had to deal with some form of cancer, they kind of disappear from your venue. And my hope is that in a lot of ways, people will see that they have a lot of company with this, that they have a lot of support, and there's ways to kind of move forward. And if anything, it helps you, in a sense, battle the disease itself. Cancer's tough. There's no other way around it. It's a shapeshifter of a disease. The doctors, when I was speaking with them, felt, you could learn part of it and stop part of a huge aspect of it. But unless you really understood more of it and were able to kind of rid the body pretty much of all the cancer, it was going to come back, and it was going to come back with a vengeance. And that's probably unchanged today, despite the huge amount of efforts and the huge amount of money that's gone into it. So, again, my hope is with Cancer Crossings, you see a very vibrant group of doctors, and there's certainly great groups out there right now, but it also, you're focused then on the family and what we did as a family, and hopefully people will realize in reading Cancer Crossings, oh, okay, I'm a part of that too, and some good can come out of all this.
Well, and I know when you were doing your initial research, there were these names that kept popping up. Was that the main way that you chose the different doctors to talk to, was based on just seeing these repetitive names coming up? Or was there another way that you went through your selection process?
Yes, ma'am. It started with seeing them on the clinical trials, for sure. But pretty soon I realized, and some of them told me this, and frankly I didn't quite believe them at first, is how much of a minority, how ostracized they were at this period of time from the rest of the medical community. It wasn't like there was a cast of thousands out there, in a sense, that carried the water, so to speak, in the battle against childhood leukemia. It was really a very few amount of doctors and maybe 6 to 8, maybe at most 10 hospitals across the country. And that almost sounds absurd today, because you would kind of think, well, hang on, people are moving ahead, they're looking to cure a disease. Of course, they would have almost unanimous support, but that wasn't the case at all. Back during the 60s especially, and again, you go back and look at the Handbook of Pediatrics, the mindset was, this is such an invasive, difficult disease, almost why bother? And it was almost like, yeah, we got to make the patient comfortable because there's nothing else we can do. And it was very radical that these 5 or 6 doctors, the cancer cowboys, and then just this very select number of hospitals they were working at, Roswell Park in Buffalo, Dana-Farber in Boston, MD Anderson in Houston, certainly National Institutes of Health outside of Washington. It was a very short list. And that the fact that they had the chutzpah, that they had the kind of the wherewithal to take this on through their peers, and they were really criticized for that in many ways. How dare you take this on? We as a medical community decided it's a losing proposition. What gives you the right to go after this? And, I've already mentioned cancer cowboys, that these doctors were nicknamed. They were also called a lot of other names. They were called killers. They were called poison pushers. They were called misfits. And these were often coming from the medical community, their peers themselves. A major reason they were called so many names, I think, is, number one, they had the gall to take this on. But just as importantly, their, in essence, their approach, their techniques was so radical at the time. And people just weren't ready for it. Today we kind of take for granted, chemotherapy, it's going to be a cocktail. I mean, that's kind of the buzzword out there. It's going to be a cocktail of many different types of medicines, and the combinations will change, the dosages will change. You might have, if you're battling cancer today, your own personal chemotherapy cocktail of 4, 5, maybe even 6 different types of drugs. They're going to change over time because the cancer is going to change. It's very elusive. To use chemotherapy drugs in combination in the mid-60s was considered almost absurd. It was considered that you're almost experimenting with patients. It was considered so far over the edge that a lot of major doctors and major hospitals wouldn't come close to this. They wouldn't touch it. And the fact that these guys saw a way through that and, in a sense, gave us almost this gift that we have today of fighting cancer, I just think is remarkable. And I remember the first couple interviews I did with this, and some of the people I just mentioned, James Holland, for example, unfortunately just passed on about a month ago. He was still working at Mount Sinai Hospital till the age of 92. He was at that point battling women's breast cancer. Donald Tinkle started up St. Jude Research Hospital in Memphis that you see the advertisements for. They were all part of the Cancer Cowboys. And I was stunned the first couple interviews and conversations I had with these doctors, how much criticism they got. And that surprised me. And then to hear about how strong they had to be in the wake or, in the face of such criticism, I just find to be almost as courageous as anything they came up with from a cancer fighting aspect.
I just can't even imagine, because it must have been just horrible, the criticism that they received, and a lot of times being pioneers, they do get pioneers get that criticism.
Yeah, very much. And I guess this is something I kind of underestimate about pioneers is, yeah, okay, you're going to go against convention. Okay, that sounds easy enough, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. And what these doctors went through, I find mind-boggling on a couple fronts. It's one thing to be criticized by your peers, in a sense maybe people you went to school with, people you're in the same field with, etc. That's got to be really tough, and you've got to be really strong. But also remember, at this point in time, we're talking, again, early to mid-60s as they're getting going, their success rate initially, because leukemia is such a devastating illness, was not very high. And so they were also losing patients on a pretty regular basis. And so, here you are dealing with one aspect of it at the hospital where you're losing patients, and how you're going to go ahead. I remember talking with Dr. Pinkel at one point. He was talking about probably the roughest night he ever had at Roswell Park in Buffalo before he moved on to Memphis. And he lost like 3 children roughly over the course of a day, to leukemia. Mm-hmm. And he went home that night and he was just distraught. He was wore out. And he was even wondering how he was going to go into work the next day. And he came up with this line that I found amazing. He said something in effect of, if you saw somebody drowning, like in a stream or a pond, your first reaction wouldn't it be maybe how difficult is it to be to save them, how deep the water may be, how fast the rapids may be, all these things. No, the first thing that's going to flash through your mind usually is, let's save them. What can I do? And that's what he came back to and went to work again the next day. And the resiliency and just the determination of these guys, these doctors, and certainly the nurses too, because they were as much a part of this as anybody, I just still find amazing. Because I think so much even today, maybe it's because we're living in the world of Facebook and Twitter and all this, but we kind of bristle at criticism. We kind of pull back. Somehow the Cancer Cowboys found a way to move ahead.
And it must have just been extraordinarily difficult, and you'd probably have to have really thick skin. But to have that kind of passion to realize that, hey, I'm going to keep, forging ahead and keep moving forward because it's the right thing to do. Because stopping, my goodness, I'm so glad they didn't. I have a friend whose daughter went through leukemia, she as a teenager actually, and 2 years ago she was just diagnosed with being cancer-free. And you look at the research that's been done behind this, and these 3 doctors pretty much are at the forefront of that.
Very much so, and they also had a way. It's funny because I now try to practice mindfulness, I'll meditate, things like that. And these doctors and nurses, in their own way, were as mindful as any teacher I've ever studied under, on that spiritual front. And they could find, they would do clinical trial after clinical trial. And a clinical trial is simply, you've got a certain amount of people, you, in this case, usually children. You're giving some form of treatment, another form of treatment. Maybe some you're not giving any at all. They've got a placebo, and nobody knows what they're receiving. And then you're able to very much see what the results are. Oh, we use this drug. Say we use methotrexate, or we use donomycin, and that helped things. Whereas maybe another drug didn't help things as much. They could take, say, the most devastating, what I would see as a devastating clinical trial, where, the drugs they were trying, or the new chemotherapy regimen, or even some of the apparatus, and maybe we get into that later, they were trying out, maybe it didn't pan out. Maybe it didn't really work out that well. Maybe you've got 50 kids in this clinical trial, and few, if any, turn the corner. Few, if any, go into remission. They were able to take, even in a clinical trial like that, which you or me would probably look at and go, oof, boy, that was brutal. Nothing really worked. Mm-hmm. They could find like that sliver of optimism or hope and kind of, pull it out and say, okay, hey, hang on, let's look at that. That helped a little bit. Let's see if we can build off that. Conversely, say a clinical trial which put a lot of kids into remission, which you and I would probably, wow, that's a great success. Okay. They would be maybe a little bit more cautionary and go, okay, that's good, but let's be a little wary of this aspect, or maybe how this drug interplayed with that one. As my Zen teacher has a saying, something like, in a sense, nothing's ever all black and white, so to speak. There's no definitive either way. He often says, okay, in that field of white, did you see the dot of black? Conversely, in that field of black, did you see the dot of white? Meaning, you're looking for just these very incremental things, but they make all the difference. And the only way you see them, the only way you're cognizant of them, is if you're not that worried about the past. You're not going, well, I'm basing this clinical trial, I'm really focused on the last one. No. You're not that worried maybe about what the future is going to be. You're trying as much as you can to be present and being in the moment. And these doctors were about the most, as I said, about the most mindful people, about the people that live the most in the present of anybody I've come across in a long time.
Was there anything that really surprised you when you had your conversations with these three doctors?
Yeah, I mean, I was constantly surprised. Part of it was I didn't know to let go of time. But,
I can only imagine.
But a sports writer, it's funny because we just did the audiobook. We finished up the audiobook for Cancer Crossings, 3-4 weeks ago. It was pretty much done. But we had to go. I did it. This was very personal to me. Other people have done audiobooks for some of my other books, like Summer of '68 and Castro's Curveball. But I was adamant I really wanted to do this one, and I really had to sell myself and do some voice stuff and everything. And Blackstone Audio, bless their hearts, said, "Yep, okay, we're going to let you do it." But just a couple of weeks ago, I went back into the studio in D.C. and we just had to go over a lot of the medical terms again. Methotrexate, donomycin, 6-MP, mostatin, because I butchered them so much when I was reading them the first time. And so I had to say, like, methotrexate again, and they were going to drop it in, like, about, 60 different places where it is in the audiobook. I was constantly surprised, and I guess I was surprised a lot by their humanness, and I also was surprised by this from my family standpoint, because I kind of forgot a lot about that, but also how vulnerable and how open they made themselves, especially when they were taking on acute lymphoblastic leukemia. A story I loved. We talked just a little bit earlier about the chemotherapy drugs and used in combination, many different combinations. That goes back to the Cancer Cowboys. That's them. That's them saying, let's try this, even though the whole world's going, oh, God, no, don't do that. But a story I love with them is they're sitting around one time, and they would get together periodically, even though they were scattered around the country, often up in Buffalo, and it was in the Holland's kitchen. And Jimmy Holland, who was James Holland's wife, who was a great doctor herself and came up with a lot of the psychology and what the patients are feeling about cancer, and did some amazing books on that, The Human Side of Cancer. I highly recommend. One night they're all sitting around, and somebody said, boy, it'd be really great if we had kind of this machine, this magic machine, that could spin the blood and separate out the platelets and the granulites and all these things that would really help, especially in fighting cancer in children. And because at that point in time, you didn't have any of this. And as a result, they were often putting whole blood in the kids, and that wasn't helping things at all. So everybody's like, yeah, that'd be great. Oh, boy, that'd be something. That'd be great to have. The next day, and I don't know about you and me, but a lot of places I've worked, we'd have conversations maybe like this about other matters. Wouldn't it be great if we had this or could do this or whatever? And the next morning, we probably would return to work as usual. The next day, the cancer cowboys started to build the machine. I find that so mind-boggling. That's such a real, just a real leap of faith, because none of them had any background in machinery or materials or anything like this. But they started, well, let's try. And in fact, one doctor down near the National Institutes of Health's offices outside of Washington ended up, his whole office was just almost encased in all this type of plastic tubing that was wrapped all around inside his office. And he said, how can we figure this out? And through some real good fortune and some people coming into the procedure just kind of out of the blue that knew more about machinery, that were able to give significant money to it, they built it. They built the blood centrifuge machine we still use today, that spins the blood, separates out the platelets, granulites, all this stuff. And that's always amazed me. But then you take it a couple steps further. Okay, they patented it. Okay, that's to be expected. But then they made the blood centrifuge machine, which they'd kind of dreamed up around some meeting about wouldn't it be nice to have something like this. They made it free to any hospital that wanted it. And that's one of the things I found myself, when I heard that going, ooh, I don't know if that would happen today. Because we're so locked into how much money different things can make and et cetera. And that's one of the things, I don't want to say these guys were paupers, and they sure weren't. I mean, they made good money and such, but the money wasn't the end result. I mean, here they are, they made this major advancement in building this machine. They're the ones that pretty much did it, and yet they didn't hang on to it for their own gain. They pretty much made it open to the world at that point.
What's astounding to me is most people don't even realize that the centrifuge was just, within our lifetime, my lifetime at least, it was invented. And most people don't even look at that going, gosh, it hasn't been around that long. You look at these things going, you would expect for it to be around a little bit longer, that, these guys really, in many ways, pulled us out of the Stone Age when it comes to cancer treatment.
Very much. And it's pretty much a bunch of doctors sitting around one day after a long day at the office over dinner at a friend's house, and the conversation comes up, oh, it'd be great to have this. But the conversation didn't end there. It kept going. It planted enough seeds in a couple, and enough brilliant minds that they were able to proceed with it. And I just love that story. I mean, when I heard that story, I was going, wow, okay, that's how you move ahead in the world. That's how you reverse such great odds. That's how you take something from 10% to 90% cure rates. It's this combination of dreaming a little bit, but then the next day kind of rolling up your shirt sleeves and going, well, let's try to do it. even though they had such little experience in doing such things.
Yeah, well, or they did have the experience, it was with the human body, and they know what they needed. They know what the end result was that they wanted to achieve, regardless if they knew the mechanics behind the machine that would, be able to do it for them. I'm sure they probably had a few engineers that came on board a little bit later, but it's so interesting that something so simple could produce such a profound effect.
Very much so. And the other thing I guess I'd put in here, Marianne, too, that came soon on the heels of the blood centrifuge machine is these guys, and this whole group, and I'm saying guys, but I'm both meaning the doctors and the nurses, they were willing to open up their thinking even if a certain way had got them pretty far down the road. And what I mean by that is that soon after the blood centrifuge machine, they were still being stymied to a large extent. They were putting more and more kids into remission from leukemia. But what was happening to a fair amount of the patients, to the kids, was they would go into remission 6, 12 months, then the cancer would come back. And it would come back with a vengeance, to such a point that many would end up, unfortunately, dying before they could really get a handle on things again. And they started going, okay, what's going on here? And our body's amazing. It's just an amazing, piece of machinery, work, whatever you want to call it. And we have a thing in our bodies, all of us have it, called the blood-brain barrier. And it means, say, if I don't know, doing like a secret agent thing and you get injected with poison by the dastardly villain or something, yeah, it's really going to wipe you out. But probably that poison isn't going to go into the brain or the spinal canal because of this barrier. It kind of diffuses things. It goes back to when, way back in evolution, I guess. But this was working against them, in a sense, in trying to cure cancer, because they were, in a sense, giving good medicine into the kids, whether it's methotrexate or dynamycin or whatever it may be. But the cancer was finding refuge in the spinal canal and the base of the brain. And in a sense, the drugs weren't getting there in appropriate levels to stop it. So therefore, kids would go into remission and then relapse. And as I said, the relapses were usually often fatal. This is one of the things I loved about these guys, is till this point, whether it was chemotherapy combinations, whether it was devising the blood centrifuge machine, an array of things that had led up to this, pretty much the unspoken motto was more. If in doubt, more. More meds, maybe higher dosages. It's amazing what the human body can kind of take on. It was kind of almost more. But in this case, even though that had been their mantra, that had been pretty much their slogan for a good decade, they were able to just kind of step back and go, okay, hang on, we've got a different problem here. This isn't quite working. The cancer's residing on the other side of the blood-brain barrier. We've got to figure out a way to get the meds there. And I love this. What they did, instead of more, is they took a drug like methotrexate, which has been around since the late 1940s. It's a great cancer-fighting drug. But more dosages of it weren't getting past the blood-brain barrier into the spinal canal and the base of the brain. So what they decided was, hang on a minute, instead of higher dosages, why don't we do lower dosages, and we'll do it over a longer period of time. Instead of maybe a couple weeks of high dosage methotrexate, let's do intermediate to even low dosages and stretch it out, a month, 2 months, maybe even longer, if the patient's, still going. And it worked. I just love that change in philosophy. It kind of showed how these guys could pivot and how nothing they came up with was, in a sense, sacred. In a sense, they would take something that worked last week, but then maybe call it into question or turn it around a bit if they felt it would now work better today. And I think that's amazing, because I I think so much, whether you're in business or medicine or sports or whatever it may be, we're often a little bit of a victim of what worked in the past. We somehow think we always need it, but it's always got to be that way. These guys were able to spin enough and call into question their own philosophy and their own approach and say, in this particular case, more might not be the way. It might be lesser dosages, but stretch it out over a long period of time. And that's what kept kids in remission. That's what made it today a 90% cure rate.
You're so right, because a lot of times, especially when it comes to discoveries or things that people implement, they do get personally and emotionally attached to it. And so making pivots, is not something that's necessarily an easy thing just from a human perspective to do. And these guys, they did it so amazingly.
Yeah, they learned it. I think you're absolutely right, Marianne, because, hey, I got here doing this. I'll just keep trying to do more of it. And if anything, that's being really mindful, being, okay, I'm right here in the present, what do I need to do? And ironically, I spoke earlier in trying in Cancer Crossings to find places where, the cancer cowboy story intersected with my family, and specifically with my parents' story. And in a way, that's what my parents during this point did really well, too. I didn't realize it till I was almost toward the end of writing the book. And one reason it's called Cancer Crossings is we sailed as a family. That was our common activity. And we often sailed across Lake Ontario. We sailed hundreds of times across that, 40 miles of open water, no bigger than a 30-foot boat. All these things that I thought were normal until I started explaining them to my own children, and they looked at me like I was a crazy man. We always think our childhood's normal until we start trying to explain it to other people. What are you stuff? But it wasn't until I was finishing up Cancer Crossings, and I had forgotten a huge amount of dates and such, and my advice to anybody doing a family memoir is find the person in your family that remembers dates and get a timeline for you, or else you're sunk. In that case, it was my brother Chris, the middle brother, who's the keeper of all dates. He'd call him up and say, when did that? I'll give you the exact date. It wasn't until I was finishing up Cancer Crossings, and I'm looking at the timeline. My brother was diagnosed roughly early spring of 1966, March of 1966. By that summer, by the middle of that summer, my father, who at that point was the only one in the beginning who knew how to sail, had all of us sailing. And soon, by the following summer, we're sailing across Lake Ontario. We're going to the Canadian shore, etc. And even though my dad had never articulated this, I suddenly went, of course he taught us how to sail. This was kind of his personal pushback against having a son diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, in this case ALL. And you have to remember, my dad's not the most religious guy in the world, but he is spiritual, especially in terms of things of nature. And to him, the wind is an amazing force. It's invisible, yet it changes in direction and velocity. And he was very intent on teaching us all growing up not only to sail, but to read the wind. And they kind of go hand in hand. You're not going to have your sails trimmed right unless you have a pretty good idea of what the wind's doing. And I called him up as I was finishing up Cancer Crossings, Marianne, and I said, Dad, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you taught us all how to sail because this was kind of your gift to us about how elusive, capricious, confusing, mysterious life can be. And if anything, that was underscored by, in my case, a sibling, in your case, a son, having this disease. I still remember this was a long pause on the other end of the line. And then he, in his typical way, he said, of course it was. Well, gosh, you could have told me that about 45 years ago to solve some hours of therapy for me, but that's okay.
I'm almost crying hearing this. It's just like, the way that you explain it is so heartfelt, and your dad's, his response was like, oh, of course, I mean, about time someone picked up on this.
Well, you bet. He's usually his way. I think I've got all these revelations at times. I thought of that years ago.
Yeah, he's like, he finally caught on. But and what a beautiful thing to share as a family, to be able to spend that time. Because when you're on a boat, I mean, I've been boating, and when you're on a boat, and especially sailing, I mean, it is a team effort,
Yeah, like it or not, you got to be a team effort. and it's funny because I was doing an appearance the other day with a dear friend of mine who was moderating the conversation, and I had never. Again, that's something that's probably right out there, and I hadn't figured out. My grandfather was a civil engineer. My father was a civil engineer. For a long period of time growing up, I was expected to be a civil engineer. We've already heard about my problems with math, so it's probably a good thing I didn't become an engineer. But, that was supposedly what I was going to do at one point. My editor for Cancer Crossings pointed out, he said at one point, I think you probably would have become an engineer, a civil engineer, if your brother had lived. In a sense, you had something traumatic happen to you, and how'd you feel about that? And I remember thinking, I think it was Jim Harrison said this, a novelist, when something like this happens to you, especially growing up, you don't tend to compromise anymore. You know the time is limited, and you better not waste it, so what do you really want to do? And frankly, going into writing in my family was, I don't know, I might as well have gone to the moon. People weren't quite sure what to make of that. But when we were doing this appearance the other night, I was saying roughly, the same thing, how radical it was to not be an engineer, not join the family firm. And the moderator pointed out, well, no, but you may not have become an engineer, but you're still doing the family business. And I went, huh? And she said, you're writing about the family. You're having that story move forward, and so in your own way, you're a part of the family business.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not just that, but bringing to light the legacy of the three doctors as well that had dedicated their lives to cancer research. And bringing that to light, I think, is such a huge thing. We have so many unsung heroes that I think it's important for us to understand where some of our beginnings come from.
Very much so. And I think just to, the beginnings, but also their thought process. And again, that's what really pulled me up short at times. And again, I remember that with these doctors, and I'm on Holland, Pinkel, Sinks, we throw in some others, it wasn't kumbaya time when they were all sitting around. It wasn't like, singing songs around the campfire. I mean, they really disagreed on a lot of things, but they were able to kind of state their piece and then move ahead for the common good, which I think is something we've kind of lost a little bit today, too. And it's funny because, as I was saying earlier, Marianne, a lot of my books have been sports. I've always been fascinated by groups and teams, and why does this group or team win, and this one arguably has more talent, but they don't. And so, in this team of doctors, and I've covered some amazing teams. 1980 Olympic hockey team. 1968, wrote a book about the 1968 Detroit Tigers. I mean, the list goes on and on. This group of doctors and nurses was as resilient and as good a team as any sports team I've ever come across and had the good fortune to know. And frankly, that's kind of what I hung my hat on early on, because as you could tell, when I started on this, number one, I felt, oh gosh, I'm under the gun time-wise. How much longer are these doctors going to be with us? Number two, holy moly, what's the difference between methotrexate and donomycin and all this other stuff, and what's all that mean? The first several months, I just felt I was in the tall grass. I was in way over my head. And it took a good friend of mine, actually a guy I went to college with, a great writer too, Howard Mansfield, to point out, he just said, "You're doing it again." And I went, "What am I doing again?" I'm doing anything again. And he said, "You're doing it again. You're writing about a group of underdogs that somehow overcame great odds." And as soon as he said that, I went, "Oh yeah, I can do that."
It really does bring to light, what you have a passion for in your writing. There are those underdogs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sports now.
No, and I don't know. I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald that said, especially if you're doing, writing, artists, anything like that, you tend to gravitate towards similar themes or, similar constructs or situations. I remember earlier in my career being, I'm doing, kind of another team-driven story. And often, I had an old teacher of mine, he said there's only two types of stories. There's a journey story, which would be like Star Wars or Hero's Journey with Joseph Campbell, etc., or A Stranger Comes to Town. Now, I'd argue there's different types of stories. We shouldn't slice that, but if you want to go in very broad strokes, that probably works. And I'd kind of beat myself up a bit and say, good gosh, why am I doing another journey story? And finally, Marianne, I don't cheer anymore. That's what I do. And it has to do with, cancer doctors as opposed to a 19 Olympic hockey team. Oh, well, that's fine by me. So, but yeah, that seems to be what I kind of gravitate toward.
Well, I'm so glad that you wrote Cancer Crossings because it's such a profound book on so many levels. What is your family, how do they feel about this book?
They were really pretty fair about it. They're in it, and then they kind of, and some members of the family were more, I guess, suspicious than others. They've all read it. I haven't been ostracized from the family. I don't know. We'll see what happens this Christmas. I'm not quite sure, but they were. And the reason I'm saying fair was they were kind of realized early on. Number one, they know me, and when I'm onto a project, I tend not to let it go. But they also, as one said, it was my brother Chris, and that's my sister Susan, they said, this is going to be your take on it, your perspective on it. And they even kind of said if I wanted to do mine, I'd write my own book. I'm going, yeah. But I think it kind of brought us together a little bit. In some ways, my parents are getting on in age now. They're roughly, mid-80s, about the time I was chasing the cancer doctors a couple of years ago. And it's really very interesting to suddenly realize in putting this together, this is my parents at their best. And that's a good thing for any child to kind of realize at some point. Okay, what were my parents at their best? And I think I learned a lot about my siblings, too. I mentioned my brother Chris, who's the keeper of all dates, which I've really come to appreciate. My sister Susan is kind of the keeper of emotions, if that makes any sense. I would kind of bring up certain times or certain incidents, and she'd be the one kind of saying, well, I was kind of feeling that at that point. She would kind of go to the emotion of it, which is very pivotal if you're trying to create a scene or create a story. So my admiration for all of them has increased a ton. And I've kind of realized that my brother died when I was 17. I was a junior in high school. I pretty much left for college, end of the next year. And I've been kind of running toward the horizon ever since. I've lived on both coasts. I really don't live very close to family now. But since Cancer Crossing has been done and since I've gone out and talking about it a little bit, I found myself the other day telling a friend, I guess I got to figure out where home is because it's time for me to come back home. That's a good lesson to learn from anything you're doing, I guess.
Yeah. I think you bring this story home for a lot of people who might be just at this point where they're kind of going, gosh, we've just gone through this, and we're feeling these emotions, or we just found out. I think it provides people a lot of hope when they see how hard some of these physicians have fought for them, what your family has gone through, and just to bring that all into a full picture gives people, and I'm probably using hope a little bit too much, but it is like this sense of hope or sense of relief that there's another side to all of this.
Yeah, and I think just knowing the story, I think, is reassuring in a way. I ran into a woman a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to her after an event, and she had already read parts of Cancer Crossings, and what immediately clicked for her is she has a daughter, I want to say roughly mid-30s, who had ALL and survived. And okay, that's awesome, rejoicing. But now she's able to kind of go back and go, hang on, here are the doctors, here's how they did it. And if anything, sometimes people will say, geez, this must be, kind of difficult to remember your brother in this way. Well, yeah, no. But in a lot of ways, my brother and the kids from, say, the 60s into the 70s are the legacy, in a sense the kids today are the legacy of those early patients. In a sense, what those patients did and what they went through, their story lives on in the success we have today with, like, this woman whose daughter is now in her mid-30s, and probably wouldn't be in her mid-30s if it wasn't for these doctors, and certainly if it wasn't for patients like my brother. So, again, yeah, we are using hope a great deal, but my sense is that this can reassure people, that it can kind of say, hey, I'm not alone, and I think it always helps. This is why we tell stories, is to kind of say, well, hang on, before this there was these doctors and these patients, and what they learned continues to ripple through the medical community. What they did was a medical marvel, in my opinion, a miracle, and we're still reaping the benefits of that today.
I agree with you 100%. I think that just knowing what these doctors had to overcome to persevere and stay on path with their passion in regards to finding a cure for cancer and overcoming cancer is just astounding as it is. I mean, I can't even imagine everything they went through, and of course, we're not giving it all away because people need to go pick up their own copy of Cancer Crossings, get their own copy of the book, and it is a heartfelt read. And Tim, I've got to tell you, once I picked it up, I could not put it down. So I'm
thank you.
I've not read any of your sports books, but if they're as good as this, I'm sure they're flying off the shelves. My goodness. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn about, like, the events that you're doing and be part of your community? Where can they get in touch with you?
A number of places, Marianne. Website is Tim Wendel, WENDEL.com. On Twitter, I'm at Tim_Wendel, WENDEL. And Facebook, I seem to have two things up and going right now. Facebook's out of control. They can find me on Facebook, just Tim Wendel, or they can find me at Tim Wendel Books, where I've been putting up some excerpts. I've been writing a column for Psychology Today over the last couple months, and actually just finished one that just went up a couple days ago for Writer's Digest for the writers that might find it a little bit interesting. It's pretty much about, after you've done a number of books in one field, what are you looking, if you're looking to change fields, in my case I was, at least in the view of a great many editors, what you can do as a writer and such to not be pigeonholed all the time. I hate being pigeonholed. So those are all great places, Facebook, Twitter, and website, and people can reach me through the website. I've been responding to a good many emails there.
Well, I know your book is available in all major retailers, and you have events listed on your website where people can purchase your book and hear one of your author talks in regards to the book itself, beyond this great conversation we've had today. Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us today. This has been such a treat to spend this time with you.
Oh, my pleasure, Marianne. Thank you very much for having me on, and it was great. And I just hope, we're back to hope, but this will resonate with some people that maybe are facing this, personally themselves. So it was great to be with you.
Well, when we talk about cancer, we can definitely use a lot of hope.
It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you, Tim. Again, if you're looking to connect with Tim, you can do so at his website, timwendel.com. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.